Hello and welcome. My name is Jeff Samuels. I'm the interviews editor for FLT Mag. You can find us at fltmag.com. And as a reminder, FLT Mag is a publication of IALLT, the International Association for Language Learning Technology. Before I introduce our two guests today, I just want to mention that this is a series of interviews that we're doing. And right now, we're in the midst of a mini series on startups and how one might develop software from ideation all the way through to launch. And so our guests today have done that. They've taken ideas for software in the world of language learning and language learning technology and brought them all the way to fruition. And they have live actual products. Both of these folks were competitors and winners in the Launchpad that is run out of the University of Hawaii annually. And so they referred us to them and vice versa. So we're pleased to be joined by Scott Cardwell and Leslie Omaña Begert. Sorry. Begert, thank you. So Leslie, since I've already butchered your name right off the bat, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your product and we'll go from there, and then we'll let Scott have a turn and we'll go back and forth.
Yeah, hi, I'm Leslie Omaña Begert, and co-founder of Fabulingua. And what we do is that we teach kids ages 2 to 10 a new language through interactive digital stories that are set in a game-like environment. So in terms of what my background, I was raised in a multilingual home. I lived in Barcelona. We spoke English at home, but everything outside was Spanish. My mom was from Norway. She was very multilingual as well. And I don't know if you want some more my background of the company or like how the two came to be together.
Yeah, particularly how you became interested in developing a technology product rather for language learning. What gave you the idea?
Okay, so kind of with that background for me, I also went on to study French, and having had a sort of 1 year at French kindergarten really helped with that. So I ended up having a sort of pretty multilingual life. I worked at a French company out of the UK, so I worked a lot in France. Then I moved to China, spent 6 years there, learned Mandarin, had a lot of amazing experiences actually in the art world as an artist, and studied sculpture in Mandarin. Then moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and had a whole other life there in real estate. So for me, I had all of these sort of extremely, fortunate professional and personal experiences because I was able to speak many languages and kind of was pretty fearless about learning new ones. And so I really wanted that for my kids. So when I was pregnant with my eldest, I knew I wanted that, but I didn't start off right off the bat. It was like when he was about 2 years old and visiting family in Venezuela that I was like reminded that I really wanted to bring this to him. And for us, changing family language was really hard to just be like, okay, now we're going to speak in Spanish. It was really unsuccessful with a toddler. They're extremely opinionated and invincible when they choose to be. And so no Spanish was like his calling card whenever I started. So I needed to find an alternative. And I looked high and low, and everything I found that was for children was super token. It was like, oh, learn your colors, learn your numbers, and then they'd stop, right? And then there was this massive gap between what they taught, and then there's all these adult products or products that adults would use, or people who are at least proficient in reading and were kind of middle school and older. And there was nothing in the middle. And yet these kids were expected to end up in a place where they would become bilingual. And so I really, after a long time researching, ended up realizing that I had to do something myself for them. And I started developing this technique with my own children, using stories, because those were kind of like a very immersive experience, right? The power of story is so strong. But initially, I realized that I needed to, basically I started using the sort of simultaneous translation skills that I'd gained through college, and I started translating the stories. It's the only way that I could keep my kids engaged in the story. Basically, later on, I went on to find out was because what I was doing was making the story's comprehensible. Before that, they were just gibberish to my kids. So basically this like on the fly simultaneous translation was what hooked them into the story, and suddenly they were interested and they were all over it. And so long as I carried on doing that, they were participating in the story. And then eventually I started to pull the translations back, and they already knew the story. So then they were able to engage in it in various different ways. So that was really, you know, it was when they got to school and started getting little Spanish lessons in schools, and the teachers were like, are you serious? You don't speak Spanish at school? Because like his level of learning is off the chart compared to his friends. It was like we were speaking Spanish at home. And I was like, we don't speak Spanish at home because like it's a battle. So that's out. And I was amazed at how effective it was that you know, just reading a certain amount of stories, you know, per week was having this result. And I was like, wow, imagine if I fully did something more substantial. So then I did that with my daughter. She came later, so she kind of got the benefit of the scar tissue on the older child's side. And with her, that's when really I started thinking about turning it into technology. But, you know, yeah.
Well, that's great. Scott, I imagine that having looked at your both Fabilingua and Immerse Me, yours does not seem to be for children. So I'm assuming your path was somewhat different. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I've always kind of been really interested in entrepreneurship from quite a young age, and always read about people like Richard Branson and things, and kind of aspired to. It seems so exciting, being in a startup or being in a venture where you have to kind of make decisions on the fly, and I also happen to be very passionate about travel and languages and the opportunities that they provide, and so I started my career working for an online technology company that did language learning at the very start, and that was really awesome. We got to run sort of these competitions inspiring thousands of students around New Zealand and Australia and further around the world to kind of learn languages, and I kind of caught the bug from that, and I worked there for about 8 years, and then decided to go off traveling with my partner, and we took a year off and went and backpacked around Europe, as a lot of Kiwis sort of tend to do when they leave home or leave university, and so I did that in my sort of mid-20s, and it was kind of through that experience that I didn't know what I was going to do when I left the last job, and I sort of realized as I was traveling how full on it can be when you're actually in country and needing to communicate with a native speaker, and obviously the anxiety and the self-consciousness that goes with that. And so I sort of thought, could we use technology now to sort of simulate, even in a simplified way, a basic interaction, whether that's out and about, buying food at a restaurant or buying a ticket to some museum or something. And I wondered if the speech technology was good enough to understand my pronunciation in, say, French or Italian, and I kind of tested it out one night as we were traveling, and I was like, wow, it actually understood what I was saying. I mean, man, if you can use that technology, you can then create an opportunity for students to respond to questions, even if it's in a simplified manner. It's still better than nothing. And then I sort of I started reading about virtual reality as an immersive technology, and that word immersion, which you mentioned as well, Leslie, kind of pricked something in my head, and it made me think, actually, that's a word we use a lot in language teaching to help learn a language sort of the most effectively. And so I thought maybe that technology would be a good fit for language learning. And so I sort of came home from my trip with a few ideas and talked to a few people and ran a wee Kickstarter campaign and just went out and prototyped a scenario here in New Zealand with a local French cafe that did crepes and things, and I got them to film with me, and then I took that to the New Zealand Language Conference and said, what do you think about this concept? Would it be awesome if we did this all over the world with authentic material? And they were like, can you do that? That'd be amazing. And so I had all these teachers telling me that their son's got a coffee shop in Paris, and we can go visit them and film there. And so we got this list of places to go, and off I went again on another world tour, and filmed Immerse Me, And yeah, I mean, it was pretty much an excuse to travel and fuel my passion for both languages and entrepreneurship.
Wow. Well, that's wonderful. Well, what both of you have hinted a little bit at my next question, which is kind of a two-parter, is about ideation and bringing it to fruition, right? But the other piece, though, to me that is very interesting is the pedagogical or andragogical, a little bit more in Scott's case, pedagogical, certainly in Leslie's case, but the underpinnings here. Having looked at both your products, it's definitely not haphazard. There's structure to it. There's sequencing. There's some flexibility to jump around, but there's also some sort of paths. There's scaffolding, and so I'm curious about how it all fit together. Did you had the idea first based on a need that you saw, or was it based on let's try this, or based on the technology? So how did you merge all this is the real question. How did you merge the idea of I'm going to create this product, but then I'm going to make it really useful, worthwhile, and robust by having a strong pedagogical structure to it? So how did you pull that off? Leslie, you want to go first this time, and then we'll go back to Scott.
Sure. I had many years of my little personal feedback systems on my laps, and children are unforgiving testers. They're not polite. They don't want to kind of not hurt your feelings. So really it was a lot of testing it in real life with them, to eventually realize, so that first time that we go through a story, what I called my magical translations, as I was kind of trying to make it interesting for them. I really had to, I had a lot of back and forth with how long to make our chunks, because with a traditional bilingual book, you have a whole bilingual page, and then, I mean, one page in one language, and then another page in another. And by the time you've got here, you kind of forgot what you read there. And basically what my kids were doing was just ignoring the target language and just listening to their native language. So I then figured if I shortened that, so that there was still a flow, but there was not enough time to switch off, that they would constantly be engaged. So I really played with the length of what we call our IPs, our interpretation phrases is what we call them internally. So, the text is always in the target language. El perro se fue, the dog went a la playa, to the beach, y se encontró, and he met un tiburón, a shark, and that was a totally different effect to if I chopped it up to el perro se fue a, and then the flow wouldn't be there. So that a lot of that is still, honestly, I'm still the one who does all the recordings and stuff like that, and I'm the one who decides like how we slice up our translations, and that's very much based off years and years of doing it with kids who had zero tolerance for it not to be perfectly entertaining and perfectly still in the flow. Then the other thing that, then again, this was very much developed with them as my guinea pigs, is they understood it now. They had all this input, this comprehensible input, but then I felt like they needed a low anxiety way to produce output that was not output that, what's really stressful about generating your own output is that original content that you're trying to create, right? And so if you play on what children are amazing at, which is being mimics, that's what they're like born to do, and that's what they do so well, better than any adult, then you really lower that stress. So basically, I just got them to be my copycats. So the second time we'd go through a story, it'd be like, okay, it doesn't matter if you understand it now or, whatever, you always ask questions, but they've just read the story, so they did understand it. And they'd be like, okay, now it's just copy mommy, And so we developed this copycat, which really works on pronunciation. And we don't have a technology that listens back in on it. The technology that listens back in on it is the child. Because what we found is that especially with young children, kind of having something that's like, you got it wrong is very demotivating, right? And that's one of the most important things, is to keep the motivation levels high. So, but when you hear, so we have the same trend, the same phrases, when you hear yourself back just after the narrator has played back, the human ear is amazing at telling the difference. And you're just like, oh gosh, that wasn't quite like, oh. And without any self-censorship or self-flagellation over not getting it right, what you see is that in the next page, it's kind of like their ears just kind of tune in a little bit harder, and they're paying attention in this like kind of very inside out way, like their insides are trying to wrap themselves around this phrase and how to say it back better. And with kids, when they do that enough times, they lock into exactly, and we've had just, it's kind of amazing feedback from parents that are like, none of us speak English, we're in Florida, this kid sounds just like the native speaker in the, and so that pedagogy was very much developed through the kids. And then the idea of games, that came about through a lot of testing and just watching kids in situ and just paper prototyping, like, hey, would this be a fun game to play? And what we wanted to do is just get them to play with the language, get them to play with the words, and just kind of like, have a sort of sensory, as far as sensory can exist in an iPad way. And then the final one, which is read by myself, where they just record themselves reading and they have no copying prompts. That was like the again, for my children, just the final achievement for my kids. When kids read things often enough, which we've all experienced this in our own language, suddenly they start reading and you're like, whoa, my 3-year-old's a genius, they're reading. They're not, they've memorized it, right? But that's what they do. That's like how they learn how to read. And so kind of taking advantage of the fact that the child has actually memorized something when they've read it enough times, and for them to nonetheless have that sense of victory of, wow, I read that whole book in Spanish and I don't even speak Spanish. And that sense of joy and pride was something that I saw in my kids when we did this method together. And I was like, I really want them to have that. And then they can share that recording with like family, grandparents or teachers or whatever it is. So it was kind of that, and really, once we had it all lined up and had the methodology lined up, I applied for a patent on it. And it was really the patent application process which opened up, I suddenly became aware of all of the academic literature around comprehensible input for the first time, and realized then, oh, this is why it works. Like, all I knew is that it worked. I didn't know why it worked. And it was like, oh, what we're doing, we're just a platform for comprehensible input for children with things that are interesting to children. The little extra bells and whistles, the fact that we work pronunciation, the fact that we then created games that work spelling. And like, for example, so, one of our games, it's really focused on syllables. Like, that's really important in Spanish. Like, you're not going to get good pronunciation if you can't break a word down into syllables. In English, not so much, but in Spanish, it really, really matters. So, then these have just been like little bells and whistles we've added afterwards, just from insights of like, just watching how kids learn, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So you almost backed into it, but you've aligned to what practices are out there, right?
Yeah.
So just to summarize for listeners, so the kids start off reading a story, it's read to them, they listen to it, they can practice saying, but they have to start with that. Then they get games, and they have a choice of games that they can play, some drag and drop, some unscrambling and so forth, or putting words in order and so forth. And then they can read to themselves. And when they do all of these things, they also get rewards, a lot of sounds, reinforcement, and so forth. They earn stickers. And then at the very end, they can make up their own stories using the stickers that they've won. So
Yes.
It's very, I wouldn't say Pavlovian, but there's a lot of reward and, a lot of reinforcement, a lot of positive reinforcement. So Scott,
Yes.
you're sitting idly, so let's I'm sorry to, but let's turn to you here. One of the things I noticed with yours is, yes, it does listen to you. I noticed when I was playing around a little bit with the basic level French, and you're supposed to, there's a prompt and then you have a choice of 1 or 2 responses that you can give, and it listens to you. And I was sort of lazy, and I remember saying "way" instead of "we," and it transcribed it. It saw that, and it spelled it like OUAIS, kind of like "way," but it didn't want that. It wanted the proper "we," which I thought was interesting. But anyway, can you tell us a little bit about your pedagogical background to immerse me in how it's structured?
Yeah, well, I guess, the question is like, was there a pedagogical or a technology need that was unfulfilled? And yeah, I think probably both. I kind of wanted, like, when I thought about what I wanted to try and achieve, I was thinking, how can we give someone an opportunity if they can't necessarily if they're planning to go overseas, or they can't, or they're wanting to study overseas and they're wanting to practice, it's obviously very hard to take someone to the country. It's very expensive and things. Can we bring that sort of somewhat that experience to them as a way to prepare them, as a way to educate them to use the language, practice the language, build their confidence, build their fluency. And like I said, I just started with one lesson where you actually had to use the language in a real life scenario. I mean, that was it. Like, that was literally it. I was just like, can I practice using this language, using the language that I need in a real life scenario? Because if we can, then we can do lots and lots and lots of scenarios. And so I started with one lesson in one location, and then we were like, okay, well, we need more content. So we went and filmed, 3,000 or 4,000 lessons in 100 different locations across nine countries. And then we introduced, well, by doing that, we also thought about the different levels that you might as well. And then, we probably thought this would be most useful for sort of that middle school to university plus level. And then we thought, well, how can we sequence their learning so that maybe the end goal is that they're doing it totally immersively. They're not actually we're just giving them some keywords and they're constructing their response from that information. But how can we kind of work back to just practicing sort of a process that maybe Leslie's been through as well? It's kind of like an onion. It just kind of grows from a sort of from a simple idea. And then, so we introduced, pronunciation, typing, spelling, translation, immersion modes to sort of, sequence your learning. And we're working on sort of scaffolding within those modes as well at the moment, which is pretty cool. And then we sort of, throughout this process, working with language teachers, they sort of said, could you help train our students kind of working memory? Could we hide the prompt for 5 seconds and then get them to say the sentence? And they just have to hold it for 5 seconds, right? And if they can hold it for 5 seconds and then that's using their working memory, and then over time they can train their long-term memory from that. And then we sort of thought, how would it be easy to use? So we decided to set up customized layouts for teachers, which mapped our content to their scope and sequence or their unit plan or whatever textbook chapters they were following. We could sort of see chapter 1 was greetings, chapter 2 was food, chapter 3 was home, or whatever. We can rearrange our content to make it easy to find the most relevant material for teachers. And then, we sort of decided to maybe start running some competitions just to boost that motivation with students and get them wanting to go home and practice their language. So we're actually running our annual Immerse Me Games at the moment. There's another 36 hours to go. It's been running for 5.5 days so far. And we've had 500,000 sentences recorded through the program, all in context and all related to the target language that they're learning, from about 20,000 students that have been registered for that across 200 schools. And so, that's just in 5 days. And so I guess it's pretty exciting to think that, like, all of those students were at home or in a safe learning environment where there's not the same anxiety that they would have in a real life scenario, but they're getting that kind of real life simulation. And I guess it's interesting because, like, academics have now started picking up our project and doing research on it and have compared it with, like, the theory of constructivism and all sorts of things that I had no intention of designing it for at the early stage. I mean, in some ways, because I'm not a language teacher, I was probably a little bit ignorant to what theories there were. I just sort of thought, as a learner, I just want to practice the scenarios that I want to learn. It was as simple as that, but it actually is really interesting to sort of start peeling it back, and we've been getting advice from senior language teachers all the way along about how to structure this best for academic language learning. And so I've been very thankful for that.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, yeah, I was going to ask about the input that you've gotten, external reviews and using language instructors and others, developers, and so forth and so on. Can you, Scott, let me ask you to go first on this one, but can you describe a little bit your development process, starting really from idea all the way through to launch? So you have the idea, you're going to go abroad, film some real situations in the real world. Do you script that in advance? You just go in and capture what you capture and then transcribe it later? How do you create the exercises around it? All of that kind of thing. So what's the development process, and who's involved? It's more than just you, I assume.
Yeah, and Leslie, did you just want to jump in there? What was something you wanted to add?
No, you'd frozen, so but it turns out it was my internet connection. That was all.
Yeah, I saw you had a little red, you had a little exclamation point, so I knew you'd frozen for a second, but it went away.
Cool. So I mean, yeah, I mean, everything I do is always iterations. I think that's you have small batch sizes is the one concept I probably live by as an entrepreneur is don't commit too much up front until you know that something's going to work, and just try it out, prototype it. I spent like maybe $50 on our first prototype because we had to buy the food that they were making and I just shot it on my phone. I didn't use a 360 camera or anything like that. I just used the tools that were available to me to try and get a mock-up, and then from that, you go and take that mock-up to the people who ultimately you think are going to be your target customer, and get their feedback and say, what would you need to see in order to subscribe your students to this tool, and how much would you be willing to spend on having them use this every lesson to build their speaking skills and listening skills. And so you just ask your customer, really, just especially if you ask them the money question, it usually gets a pretty honest response, right? People always will support your project, but are they willing to actually spend money on the project and pay for it? As soon as that becomes the question, then they probably give you some pretty good feedback. And so, we actually, and I mean, there's avenues. I mean, I don't know what it's like around the world, but in New Zealand, there's a lot of business grants and things that you can apply for if you're doing something that's kind of new and innovative and involves R&D, research and development. So we sort of put applications in for that, and that sort of helped with cash flows, and we actually just went and sold each version of every development stage I went through. I went and basically pre-sold it to schools and said, all right, so you come back in February next year, this is Southern Hemisphere, we'll have this list of lessons that you teach ready by then, and this is how much it'll cost, and can you commit to doing that? And I guess you build really good relationships with people as well, and they trust you, and so you then you've got a target, right? But then it's called Parkinson's law, which we use all the time, which is that work expands to fill the time available for its completion, or budgets expand to fill the cost that you've got. And so you can actually use that law in reverse. You can limit how much you've got available to you and force yourself to think creatively about what you can do given those constraints. And because I didn't have any money to put into this and such, we had to it had to be sustainable from the very beginning, and we could only spend what we knew we could return from customers. And that's kind of how we've gone about it. Is every year we've done more content based on feedback, based on them buying that next version. And so that's how it's gone. And so I've managed to kind of build it all in a cash flow positive way, which is probably not the usual way that a lot of startups and things think they can do it. They think they need to go and raise a whole lot of capital from somebody who ultimately wants more back than what they've given you, and that introduces a whole amount of pressure to make a product and sell a product, but the pressure is not coming from your customers, it's coming from your investor, and the investor isn't actually going to be the one buying it. So it's sort of, it doesn't quite, sometimes it doesn't quite add up. So I think, yeah, we just took an approach where we sort of thought about our customers as our investors, and if they were willing to spend money on it, then we were probably doing the right thing. But that's just my process. I'm sure Leslie's got other.
Yeah, it's like you're monetizing user experience rather than the investor. Yeah. Leslie, do you want to chime in?
So we, I mean, the whole iterative process is also, very much kind of what our process was, starting off with a totally analog version years before actually even thinking that this was going to be a thing, to really like the first version was actually I built it on PowerPoint. We did all the transitions on PowerPoint, and took that one and just tested it, just very much following the sort of lean methodology and testing it on people before we even had a product. And there was this one kid I first, one of the early kids I tested it on, he just sort of went in and he started like touching everywhere, which if you do that on a PowerPoint touchscreen, it's like, right, that the whole thing's falling apart, right? But what it said to me was, and so I was like, oh, no, don't touch there and do, and I was like, no, you're just press the next page. But I suddenly was like, gosh, this kid, 6-year-old, his expectations are through the roof. Like I was not intending to build this, but this 6-year-old was like, dude, unless this cow can get up and sit down and start out and walk around, I'm not interested, I'm out, because I got Fortnite to play. So suddenly, that was when it was like, oh gosh, we need to actually build this on a gaming engine, because this is the expectation of this generation of children. So that was one of the sort of part of the smartest early moves that we did. And then it was just, reaching out, one person building a prototype, then going and testing, it was 6 months of development, 2 months of like solid testing in Denver on different families. We put little sensors on the children's feet so you could tell like whether they were sweating and excited or kind of totally disinterested, to really get that feedback and see whether we had, because you can't ask children, like they're hard to test, right? So, trying to find different ways of seeing that. And then we did a huge customer discovery piece, like 43 families, interviewed them for about 2 hours each. These are families that we knew were looking for to have a second language in their children's lives. They were doing it in different ways, but we didn't tell them the project we were thinking of building. It was really just like, is there a need? Are these families experiencing a substantial amount of frustration with the tools that are available to them? And it was just really, it was because of that finding that we then did decide to sort of go ahead. And initially it was just just the stories, and we were just really kind of keen on like how, even developing the stories, how do we develop those stories, etc. That was a whole process, and then eventually, now that we've got the story pedagogy, like we know the pedagogy works, now it's just like, okay, the game-like environment, how do you make it more and more interesting and more compelling for them to go back and do the same story in a different way many, many times? Because obviously that repetition is super important for language learning. So doing it in a way that's all carrot, less stick, is a really important part of what we do. So that's why, we've got all these game developers working on our project. So yeah, a lot of...
Yeah, so that actually was why I wanted to follow up with a little bit. So you guys, starting with an idea, prototyping, you can do a lot yourself and with a couple of, a little core group of people, friends and collaborators. But to get to where you guys are now, it seems to me there have to be more people involved, and then when you think ahead. So just a general question, Leslie, if you wouldn't mind going first, what have you held on to, and what have you been able to give away to others to take and run with, to keep things going and building and expanding?
So we develop everything internally. We don't, we have freelancers that work for us, but we're very much attached to creating everything in-house. There's no shortage of people who approach you and offer you to outsource your entire technology, and for us that's just not, that's you know, I really think we're doing something different, we're doing something new, and I think if you don't, for us, if like I would feel, maybe I'm a control freak, who knows, but I feel like this is not like, oh, I'm just doing an app to, I don't know, do delivery service or something that's been done a lot before. Therefore, yes, there's a methodology for how you do this. You know, using stories to teach a language in a game-like environment, there's nobody who's done it before to be able to say, this is what matters and this doesn't, we can skip this bit. So we're figuring it out so much on the fly that those insights come about from building and then getting it right, or building and failing. And you need to own that process of building right, building fail, you know, to know where you're going. And I think if for us, you know, to subcontract it out would just also just be insanely expensive.
So, but you say us, so obviously it's more than just you personally.
Oh, yeah, so sorry, my co-founder. So yes, you definitely need a really committed team of people who are in the same boat and you know are gonna be in the same boat as you. And for me, early on, I asked my husband to become my co-founder. So that, and he's the CEO, very much so that I can look after product, because I want to be razor focused on that, and I don't want to be doing all the other extremely time-consuming aspects that are also really important. So you know, it's important to have other people who are super committed in your boat, because you know, it's a long journey. There's a lot of ups and downs, and you've got to be able to see it through to the end. So yeah, that's.
Any before Scott, I have the same question, but before we jump in, I'm just curious. Any plans to expand into other languages?
Yes, for sure. By the end of the year, we're going to do English as a second language for Spanish speakers. So our methodology is very much like, right now we have Spanish for English speakers. We're going to flip that around, because the idea is that, you know, our assets, once built, are totally reusable, and you know, the least expensive part is the translation into another languages and re-recording that. And that's obviously a much bigger market for us. It's much more of a need to have rather than want to have, which is also good. But we you know, we started in Spanish for English speakers, because this is where I had this scar tissue. So this is where I knew I could be super nuanced and super targeted as to what was needed, and then translate that over to other languages. And after that, we're going to do Mandarin both ways. And then, you know, we'll look at which is the next biggest language at the time. Is it French? Probably. Who knows? I don't know.
So Scott, you're already in multiple languages, but so if you want to talk about that a little bit as well. But I'm very curious as to what the original question was. What have you held on to, and what have you kind of let other people take and run with?
So, I mean, I'm in an interesting situation where I'm neither like a language teacher nor a developer, yet here I am founding a language learning technology company. But so I guess that meant I wasn't, you know, I just needed to project manage. So I've got two co-founders that are very good friends of mine that have invested in this, and they support me a lot. Every week I write a sort of a summary of what I've done, just to kind of keep myself sane and figure out what's going on, and they always read through that, and we have a monthly sort of governance discussion about what's the future looking like, what are the major risks and things. So without essentially that independent, because they're not day to day, they have their own jobs that they do full time, and so I'm really thankful for their sort of monthly input to help guide the ship, you know, just steer it sort of slowly towards where we need to go. And then, but yeah, we've contracted like hundreds of people. So every language, we've had probably a team of 12 writers, language teachers that we've hired over summertime or during their holidays or vacation breaks to sit down and write material. I've contracted university students to edit content. We've had to cut up probably 500,000 video clips, and I just wouldn't have been able to do that by myself. So, but you know, divide and conquer. So I've got students to help me with that. I've actually hired 2 grads full time. One's a developer, and one actually speaks 3 languages. And together, the 3 of us are working full time now. But for the first maybe 4 years, I was the only full-time asset to the company, and so we contracted out all of our coding to a third party who, you know, had senior developers, and we just gave really clear, you know, scopes for them to work on based on the feedback that we'd received from our end customers. And so I just kind of went to market, found the feedback, you know, talked to the right people, and introduced myself and presented at conferences, and then filtered that back into the actual product development. And slowly, we're starting to be able to bring on, you know, full-time staff who can kind of really own that space. And so, yeah, it's been hundreds and hundreds of people involved. And yeah, I'm really thankful to everybody. And there's been some major contributors from the teaching profession who have actually given a lot of their time, because they've been our customers who have actually trialed it and tested it, and actually have been willing to sit down and write a whole bunch of feedback to take forward. So without their support, I wouldn't have been able to get as far as we've got so far. So yeah, I've palmed off a lot. I basically, whenever I have interns and grads and things helping out over a summer period or whatever, I'm the one going and getting them coffee, because I'm like, all right, you guys are busy, right? I'm just going to get in the way here. I'll go get the coffees. And do you want sushi for lunch? How are you feeling? And so I'll come back with the coffees and and, you know, clean up around them and things like that, so that they can keep focused on the job at hand.
Scott, that's called servant leadership.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I'm like, sweet, I'm out of the office. This is great.
That's it, yeah. No, so yeah, this is wonderful. So again, just to recap a little bit of something I mentioned at the outset, is the idea of doing this type of interview is, well, what if one had an idea and we're thinking of how to bring it to fruition? And so as our time starts to wind down a little bit together, I want to ask you both, just very generally, what lessons have you learned and advice would you give to somebody who is thinking, who has an idea and wants to bring it to market? Something for, and obviously something related to computer-assisted language learning, something, it could be an app, whatever the idea may be, but the next person who's going to show up at Launchpad or come to an IALLT conference, what lessons have you learned that you might impart to them? Question for either or both.
Scott, you go ahead.
I don't know. There's just that Nike, like, just do it. Like, I mean, I have got a bit of a phrase is like, success is when preparation meets opportunity. And I guess that's, you've got to prepare, you've got to do something, and then you've got to kind of roll the dice. You've got to say, well, if I'm passionate about this and I think other people might be passionate about it, then go and find your tribe. Like, go and talk to people that you think might be passionate, and it doesn't matter if they are or not, just they'll put you on to someone else, right? And so a story actually from the very first day that I started Immerse Me, right? This is probably what you want, is this, like, so I had this idea, and I already talked to friends and family and things about it, but I hadn't actually had like day one, like day one is like, you're sitting down and you're like, my whole day I'm going to work on this project, right? And I felt like a little bit like an artist where they have a blank canvas, and it was actually really quite scary. Like, I sat down on my computer and I was like, had my cup of tea, and I was like, right, today I'm going to start working on this project. And then I was just like, what do I do? And so, but right, so that was pretty fleeting. I was like, well, I guess you have to be creative, right? You have to actually, that's the definition of creativity, is creating, right? Starting from nothing and making something. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get the end product on day one, so I don't have to worry about that. What I could do is I could start reaching out to people in different, universities, maybe high schools, language teachers and things. I could just start reaching out to people and talking about it officially, right? And just say, here's what I want to do. Do you know anyone I can talk to about this, right? And so I reached out to a friend of mine that I went through university with, who I know worked for a university in New Zealand and worked in the innovation department. So I was like, she'd be a good person to call. So I called her and she said, oh, wow, that sounds like an awesome idea. She's like, could you come and present that at our next innovations day in like a week and a half or 2 weeks from now? I was like, okay. And so I went along but who she'd invited all this like media to come along and learn about what, you know, these ideas were and things. And so there was this guy from the media who saw my presentation, was like, oh, this is so cool. We need to get this out in the media. And I was like, oh, I haven't even started yet. But he's like, well, can you show me anything that can help people imagine what you're trying to do? And I was like, oh yeah, there's heaps of videos and I can kind of piece it together. He's like, sweet, let's line up a filming day in like a cafe here in Auckland and talk about what your plan is. And so I got this media item before I'd even really begun, and then that went out, and then you get all these emails and stuff from people who watch the story, who are like, oh, I can help, like this is what you do and this is how you do it, and that really just like gave me momentum, I guess. And I guess as a founder, you're always searching for momentum, and doesn't matter if you make mistakes, you just need to keep going. And that's probably like, that one little story is probably like a good example of just, don't freak out by how much there is ahead of you. Just start with what you know you can do today. And if you do it, then you'll figure out what you're going to do tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Don't try and take it all on at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree with all of that. And for me, that kind of like breaking it down, you know, it was really helpful to read The Lean Startup and to have that as a sort of manual. And I literally was like, okay, I've done chapter 1. What's chapter 2? What does he tell me? You know, and to just have, and I think I would have done it totally differently had I not read that. So that was super, super useful to be like, you know, just talk to your customers before you've even made it, you know. I think saved ourselves like years of product development by doing that. So really, I don't know. Yeah, I don't, that's where I would be like, because that says it all, right? The lean startup, you don't want to go out and raise an insane amount of money for an idea that may or may not work. So you just want to know, because at the end of the day, what you're talking about is a commercial venture. Is the product that you are dreaming about or half dreaming about, is there a market for it? Is there not? And, you know, what if you change it in this way? And is there a better, bigger market? And then being really honest with yourself about the feedback that you're getting. People want to be nice when they give you feedback. And so kind of sifting through it and this is why I was saying that kids just give this really honest feedback. They're not interested in being nice. So watching how the kids really reacted. And then, yeah, maybe raise less money to just start off with creating a very, you know, scaled down version. And then if and when you do feel that you've got a product for the market, then I'd probably say on raising more money if you're in the fundraising side of it, because it always takes longer. It's always more expensive, you know, than you ever projected it would be. So
yeah, so it's a proof of concept for sure. Yeah. So one last question before we kind of wrap up here, and then again, my thanks to both of you. This has been really interesting. So are you guys, is Fabulengua, is Immerse Me, are those where you expected they would be at this point? Are they farther along, not quite as far along? Did they go in the same path that you envisioned? And where do you see them going next? So, again, another question for both. So we put Scott on the spot last time. So Leslie, we'll put you on the spot.
We were quite surprised. Like, we built this for parents because we're parents, and so I think, you know, it's pretty expected that you would build for the need that you saw in the market. So this last year has taken us by surprise, probably largely aided by COVID, to the extent that it's actually been teachers who've come and really knocked on our door. Now, granted, we're built for parents, so we're pretty easy for parents to use, and we're not built for teachers yet. So they do have to reach out to us to use it. But we've been, on that front, really surprised how the academic community and the educator community has just been extraordinarily enthusiastic. That has been way more than we thought. I think we thought, at some point we'll build something for teachers and blah, 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 as a sort of natural progression. But it's kind of like, it's leapfrogged into the forefront. And that has been a real surprise. So really, we've kind of had to, pivot a little bit and be like, wow, if we're going to meet their needs, there's a lot of development work that needs to happen in order for us to just be able to onboard schools and set assignments and da da da. Having said that, and of course, we've been, I think I've been surprised at how at the feedback that's just like really kind of moving, and I guess people didn't expect that just with something like as simple as stories that you could really move the needle. And so getting that feedback from parents, like, wow, my kid's now speaking to me in Spanish and they never have done before. Like that kind of feedback has been much more of it, and much more like it moves parents in a way that was kind of more substantial than I ever expected. Now, in terms of all of that, am I, you were asking, would I like to have, many more million users? Of course, and so, but it's kind of looked different to what I thought, in that, the teachers are really, much more all over it than I had expected at this stage. And in terms of languages that we're putting out there, I think it's about the same pace that we had thought. Yeah, the first one's going to be the biggest one, right? We had to refactor our whole app in order to be able to add a second language. But then now that we've done that, we can add others.
Right. Same with learning a language. You learn a second language. That's by the time you're on your third, your fourth, it does get easier because you know how to do it.
Yeah. Like life.
Right.
Right.
All right, Scott, last word.
Oh, look, I mean, in all honesty, I actually think I've achieved what I initially set out to, which was I just wanted to be able to put on like a VR headset in my lounge and practice like ordering a baguette. Like as of like maybe August, September last year, so like 4 years later after I started the concept, I actually did that for the first time. And it was just like brought tears to my eyes. I was like, oh, that's so cool. So like in some ways, like the challenge I'd set for myself, I totally achieved it, which is good considering it took 5 years. But I think now that you get there, you go, well, what kind of impact can we have, and how can we make this a commercial success, sustainably and scalable, so that we can continue to do creative stuff. Like I love the creative aspect to innovation and entrepreneurship. As I mentioned at the start, it's just such an exciting place to be in. You get roller coasters, you get these absolute highs, and then you get these crushing lows as well. But you've got to be in for the game, and as long as you surround yourself by positive people and experienced people, then it's actually quite a lot of fun. And so, the next step for us is would be great to bring in some more specialists, some language teachers, developers, some creative, people who can develop really beautiful content. I'd love to take a concept like being hosted in a country by being an exchange student in a country, and take you to a country where you're hosted by someone and they take you around their city and their town and sort of show you and introduce you to their friends, and you go on experiences with them and things like that. And there's a bit of an adventure element to it, sort of maybe a little bit more of a gamified sort of approach. And if you wanted to learn, Spanish or whatever, you could have be hosted in, say, Argentina or in Chile or in Mexico or in Spain or whatever. You just find these really exciting young people that want to be student hosts, and it's kind of like the Lonely Planet. Whoever's got the job of being like a Lonely Planet writer must have a pretty, pre-COVID would have had an awesome job, traveling around the world, meeting people, filming scenarios, and then being able to provide that as experiences to people all around the world, and help prepare them for using language in the real world themselves. So, I think COVID has in some ways created an opportunity for online language learning to support in-person learning. I think there's definitely a great blended model there, and the fact that I can, there's a student right now winning the Immerse Me Games from up in Northland, which is sort of quite, no, I wouldn't say remote, but I mean, to get there from, say, America, you'd have to take like 36 hours of planes to get around the world. And here they are, they're winning the Spanish competition on Immerse Me, recording tens of thousands of sentences in Spanish from their home in Northland, and they're getting an experience, and they're enjoying it, and they're succeeding. So I think the impact that we can have on young people and hopefully motivate and inspire them to continue on their language journey, and motivate and inspire other people to go on a language journey as well. I think that's probably what gets Leslie and I out of bed every day to do what we do. So, if we can keep focused on students and learners and providing something fun and interactive and engaging for them, and support them through that, then yeah, I can see myself doing this for another 5 years and maybe another 5 after that.
Great. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you both. We've been talking with Leslie Omaña Begert and Scott Cardwell, Leslie from Fabulingua and Scott from Immerse Me. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an interview in the interview series on FLT Mag, which you can find at fltmag.com, a publication of IALLT. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you again soon, hopefully. Take care.
Thank you.